Okay, so welcome to our sixth, I think, Breakfast with Birkbeck webinar. And our topic today is Decolonising Environmentalism. We have Ivana Bevilacqua and Luciana Martins with us today to discuss this and unpack this. So over to you first to introduce yourselves. Luciana, can you start? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do at Birkbeck, and so on.
Sure. So I am a professor of Latin American visual cultures here at Birkbeck, and my first degree was in architecture and urban planning, and then I did my master's and PhD in geography, all these at the Federal University of Rio in Brazil. But I came here to do research for my PhD, which was on British visions of Rio in the 19th century. So, I came here to study the archives on the state. And so my research is based on kind of the visual and material culture of travel and exploration in Latin America. That's the main kind of framework of my research. But I'm also a kind of visiting researcher at Kew Gardens, and I've been doing a project with them since kind of a research program with them since 2015 on the collections by Richard Spruce, who was a botanist who traveled to the Amazon and the Andes in the 19th century collecting, botanical specimens, but he also collected artifacts. So we've been working in putting these artifacts together with indigenous people and, seeing what knowledge we can get from them. So in short, and I also, at Birkbeck, what I teach is a mix, really. I'm teaching a kind of foundation year lectures on Anthropocene, so kind of an art. And then at kind of BA level, I teach course on Brazilian cities, experience in Brazil, which I focus on Rio, São Paulo, and Brasilia mainly. And also another one on the space culture and environment in Brazil. And at master's level, I teach in the master's Modern Languages and Comparative Literature, and I teach a course on memory and history. So it's a kind of, very broad range. That's me. Thanks.
Amazing. And Ivana, over to you.
Thank you, Aideen, and thank you, Luciana. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. I am a human geographer, and I've been teaching at Birkbeck for the past year. And what I really value about working here is the strong sense of connection with both students, but also the supporting relationship we have among teaching staff. I contribute to a number of modules, including globalization in the contemporary world, humans and the environment, borders, development and migration, climate change, and research methods in geography. My current research explores issues of Palestinian recognition within Israel, challenging the existing literature that focus mostly on rights or participation or integration within the settler colonial structure. Rather than advocating for assimilation within these frameworks, my work contributes to a true path to lasting peace, which is grounded in justice, reparation, and forms of self-recognition. And in doing so, I examine Israel urban planning policies and how they seek to undermine and absorb the Palestinian indigenous relationships with the land, reconfiguring it within the capitalist political economy. Indeed, I argue that this process not only erases historical and cultural ties Palestinians hold with the land, but also aims to integrate these relationships into a framework that prioritizes commodification, control, and displacement, even reinforcing settler colonial structures and economic exploitation.
Okay, so for starters, I feel like this is often the way with our webinars. We end up with our first question being about words that were in the title of the webinar. So let's start by unpacking the term decolonizing, which feels like a word people might have heard before in different contexts that aren't related to the environment. Can we start with you, Ivana? What does decolonizing mean to you?
So, a bit of context here, because decolonizing has increasingly become something of a buzzword in academia, so widely used that even risks becoming an empty signifier, and yet it's held different meanings across historical periods. So, for instance, during the Cold War, the 1955 Bandung Conference and the height of the non-aligned movement framed decolonization as the political project of reimagining a third world as a space where post-independence nations could define their own futures free from Western imperialism. At that stage, decolonization had a clear material configuration tied to the tangible formation of a geopolitical space. Now, this understanding has been complicated by studies of diaspora and post colonialism, which draw attention on the entanglements between these different spaces and emphasize the importance of decolonizing knowledge in itself. So, famously, scholars like Spivak have urged to ask who is speaking and from where, but also have triggered us to rewriting decolonialization through languages that is not necessarily the English language. Now, in its current form, decolonial thinking has been most strongly shaped by Latin American scholars, famously Ramon Grossfogel, Walter Mignolo, Enric Dussel, or Arturo Escobar, Maria Lugones, and Gloria Anzaldúa. Now, decolonial approaches in this sense are particularly valuable for me because they don't only aim to deconstruct colonial structures that continues to shape global relationship, but also because they propose alternatives, sometimes drawing on pre-colonial epistemologies and ontologies. And here, what I found particularly compelling is how this work pays attention to intersectionality, particularly the interplay between decolonial thought and indigenous feminist approaches, as seen in the work of Chicana feminist scholars like Alzaldúa and Lugones. And in this sense, if we understand decolonizing as the dismantling of both material and epistemic structure, the critical question becomes, can decolonization be achieved from within Western academia? As indeed has been an institution historically complicit in colonial project. So over the last decades, we saw efforts that have increasingly gained momentum, were basically mostly characterized by student-led campaigns, such as Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa and the UK, and the movement to decolonize the curriculum in British and American university. Also within geography, this has sparked experimentation with decolonial methodologies, including creative art-based methods such as photography and filmmaking, which have been pretty central to my own research. And indeed, as Ivy Tak and Wayne Young remind us, engaging with decoloniality is crucial, but only if we remember that decolonization is not a metaphor. It basically requires giving up the material privileges and engaging in a continual process of dislearning and relearning. And in this spirit, and following bell hooks, we might say that Western academia is not the paradise, but learning can still be the space where paradise is imagined, even momentarily created.
Okay, and then a question for you, Luciana. When we kind of apply this concept to environmentalism. I guess the question is, how did we get here? In what ways has mainstream environmental policy marginalized indigenous communities and their knowledge systems? How do we end up where we're at now?
Well, there are some things that I'd like to pick up from what Ivana said, that she gave a very thorough kind of introduction, to what decolonizing means. And I think in terms of in my area, what that is related with kind of visual cultures, material cultures, and ways of seeing. What is important, there's Indian-born American photographer who's called Subhash Banerjee, and he talks about us unlearning the intolerances, and he refers to that as the idea that, think about the Arctic. People think about, the Arctic is white. Think about the Amazon forest is green, and the desert is orange. So what he says is that this is kind of, in a sense, a kind of a violence, and because we are emptying these areas of any forms of life. So what he does with his photography and with his art is to bring colors to those regions. So he goes to the Arctic, and there's amazing pictures with in different seasons, and we see that the Arctic has other forms of life. It's not a blank that can just be exploited. And so, the Amazon forest is not just a green, you have all different colors and animals and forms of life. And so it's about us changing our ways of seeing, as Westerns, changing our ways of seeing. And I think this applies, there's researcher, a scholar who's called Gustavo Bedesio, and he works on archaeology. And he was saying the way that we learn to see, for example, ruins, is always a kind of a monument. It has to be a kind of pyramid or something. But he says this way of seeing doesn't allow us to understand, for example, the environments that have been transformed by indigenous peoples, kind of for millennia, because they don't leave these kind of architectural ruins. It's a different kind of dealing with the land and with the waters. And so, decolonizing, in my view, is kind of decolonize our way of seeing, and allowing these other forms of being and relating to the world to come to the fore as valid as the Western one. And maybe, sometimes we really have a lot to learn with them. So, yeah, I'm not sure I answer your question, but it's the way that I get into that. Yeah.
No, it makes perfect sense. Could you perhaps share as well some examples from your work of ways that Indigenous worldviews around, say, land or water or ecosystems differ from what we might think of as Western ways of looking at these things? I'm particularly thinking about how different decisions or different policies would emerge from looking at things in that way.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my work has been mainly with the current work, this current project with Kew Gardens and other institutions in Brazil, the Botanic Garden in Rio, the NGO ISA, which is the Social Environmental Institute in Brazil as well, and other institutions. What the people we have been working with are from the Northwest Amazon, the Upper Rio Negro region. So they have a very particular way of dealing with their environment. The idea is that it's not centered on the human. The idea is that every human, non-human entity, the rivers, the forests, the birds, they are entities that need respect and needs negotiation with. So it was very interesting when we came, we had a workshop, Kew and Berlin, because we were working with the collections by Kurt Gumbeck, the ethnologist who went to the same region, but 50 years later. So we went to both the Ethnological Museum in Berlin and to Kew here, and the British Museum as well, because we have some collections there. And we brought a group of indigenous researchers, and they asked to bring a kind of a kumu and a baya. And kumu is a kind of a kind of shaman, and a baya is a kind of a master of ceremony. Because to approach those collections, you need to be prepared, because the artifacts that were taken, for so long, they have their own agency. And if you don't kind of protect yourself, you are, there is a problem that you're not going to be able to relate to them. So we had to adapt, Q guys to have the rituals and to put the painting in the face and to get it. And what is interesting is that the same thing that we had to do when we had a workshop in the Amazon in São Gabriel da Cachoeira, which is it's not in the indigenous territory, but it's the city that is kind of closer to indigenous territory of the Upper Rio Negro. We had to do the same kind of rituals to get into the forest. So, you have to ask permission. And this is not just, a gesture. This is really a different attitude with nature, with all the other elements, because you really, what they say is a kind of it's a cosmopolitics. You always have to negotiate, and not just, as we Western do, that they see nature as a kind of resource and, inanimate. For them, everything's animated, and you need to really get in touch with these other entities and ask permission, to them for anything that you want to do. So I think that's a kind of very fundamental difference. In terms of policy, there's a very good article, quite short one, in Science that was published in December. And it's called Indigenizing Conservation Science for a Sustainable Amazon. And this is by Carolina Levis and many others, including indigenous researchers. And they did a very nice table, I say, engage Amazon indigenous principles in sustainability research and policy. And then, they do give us hints of how to act. And I think they are very, they really match to what I've been thinking and working with, because they say, you have to move beyond dominant anthropocentric and utilitarian views of nature to recognize and work with dynamic networks of relationships. And this can advance our understanding of socio-ecological relations that support and facilitate the agency of all ecosystem participants involved. So this idea of agency of the others, is very important. The second one is by moving away from the colonialist framing of nature as pristine and uninhabited. And that's, that's where the colors come back, because the biodiversity of colors, they do diversity of colors and diversity of nature, they are related. Efforts to conserve and restore ecosystems can be more effective through the respectful inclusion of indigenous leaders and experts in research and decision-making processes. And the third one is moving away from a dominant vision of ecosystems as static and natural systems to another that maintains a set of dynamic relations among all ecosystem participants, which may require action in the context of cosmopolitical network functioning and climatological ecological cycles. So, I think this kind of sums up quite nicely, the main kind of ways that we need to think about when we are working together, and especially to listen. We have to learn to listen. We tend to try to have things. There's something about the time frame of our projects that are quite limiting, I think, in terms of the conversations that we need to have with the indigenous peoples, because they do take time. There's a lot of it's a different temporality, that this indigenous life takes, and we come with our kind of efficient kind of thinking, and that doesn't work, just doesn't work. So there is there's something that needs adjustment as well, I think, in the funding bodies, about kind of the timing for research projects, for example, because you can't do everything, you can't plan in advance as we have to do here, the project, because they have their own priorities, and so we need to negotiate. This cosmopolitics is very important, and it's fundamental. If we really are serious about working together. I'll stop here. Okay, thanks.
That makes a lot of sense, Luciana, and what you were saying about moving away from seeing things as resources, but taking this more relational view is very resonant, I think. Ivana, what about your work? What ways do you see indigenous worldviews differing from Western paradigms, and what are the implications of it?
So in the case of my research, the main aim is to compare how Israeli worldview, especially the one connected to settlers, newcomers, greatly differ from indigenous communities. Now, for indigenous communities here, we mean Palestinian, Jewish, Druze, Bedouin communities. So there is a huge variety. Obviously, indigenous communities an umbrella, which shouldn't flatten all this distinction, but obviously speak to the commonality between the two. So in my understanding, I see Israeli frameworks, especially in terms of urban planning, as reiterating a Western approach, which tend to see nature as external to humans, something to be managed, owned, even controlled or exploited, while many indigenous knowledge systems are rather grounded in relational ontologies. And this indeed emphasize this interdependence between humans and non-human beings, viewing land and water not just as commodities, but as living relatives or ancestors or caretakers. In my collaborative research, I also work with indigenous scholars in what is now called New Zealand, or Aotearoa, because we found some commonalities in the ways in which land relationships are understood. And therefore, they use the term landedness to sort of emphasize land not as an objective, but as a relationship. In other words, not as a private property, but as a shared or sacred responsibility. So Maori communities in this area understand land, which in indigenous language they call wenua, as a sort of identity and kinship. So again, not something to be owned, but something that once belonged. And again, we saw some similarities, for instance, for the case of water. Interesting enough is the case of the Wanganui River, which indeed has been granted a legal personhood, recognizing it as an ancestor and protecting it through a guardianship model informed by Maori law and Maori cosmology. This is also similar, and again, it's something that we see in this collaborative project with other indigenous scholars working in the Amazon communities, where basically indigenous community manage the forest based on this reciprocal relationship and ensuring what is taken, not in an extractive matter. And again, this is pretty much resonates with my own research, where I examine how British colonial planning, particularly during the Mandate period in Palestine, transformed actively the way land was understood and governed. So indeed, prior to colonization, land was often experienced through this very notion of landedness, a reciprocal relationship between people, ecosystems, and land in itself. And this involved, among many other things, collective forms of stewardship embedded in practice of care, cultivation, and belonging. So what happened is that British planning policies imposed instead a flat bureaucratic ontology that parsed land into discrete units, assigned individual ownership titles, and also require documentary proof of possession. So land that could not be registered within this framework, and also because very often was communally held or managed according to customary practices, was subject to confiscation. Now, this reconfiguration of land as a legal object rather than a lived relationship is at the root of many ongoing issues in Palestine today. And indeed, entire communities have found themselves dispossessed, not because they lack the connection with the land, but because they lack the kind of evidence recognized by the colonial system. So the relationship to land, grounded in care, continuity, and collective identity, was never meant to be captured on paper. And in the project I coordinated with the visual embodied methodology networks, we use methods such as art-based methodologies in geography to explore this relationship and bringing them to the fore as a oral collective archive against epistemological material erasure. So, in this sense, rehabilitating decolonial and indigenous frameworks and methods, I believe that might offer a powerful way to reimagine justice beyond these very colonial systems of recognition for a grounded self recognition, reparative justice, and the possibility of enacting grounded forms and alternative forms of epistemologies and relationship to the land against this material erasure.
Thank you, Ivana. Thinking about, how you mentioned at the start, I think, Ivana, that sometimes it can seem like policy is actually reinforcing some of these things. When we think about the apparatus and the institutions that have developed for addressing some of our global environmental problems like climate change, do you see these as reinforcing colonial structures or dismantling them, or a bit of both?
That's a big question. I think so. I think that to decolonize on environmental policy also means to critically examine and undo the colonial foundation that continues to shape how environmental issues are understood and addressed. And this obviously also involves challenging the dominance of Western scientific paradigms, which also informs top-down governance models and market-based solutions that often continues to marginalize indigenous and local knowledges, continue to erase histories of dispossession, and even reproduce unequal power relationship. So many of the so-called solutions proposed by states and corporations to address environmental crisis risk entrenching the very structures that produce these problems in the first place. So these interventions often reinforce global inequalities, particularly for racialized or migrants communities who are systematically excluded from shaping environmental policy and rarely benefit from these outcomes. And yet it's important to remind that it's precisely their labor, land, and knowledge that continues to be exploited and appropriated in the name of sustainability. So let's consider the case of green extractivism, the global rush for minerals like lithium and cobalt, crucial for solar panels and electric vehicles, is driven by climate goals, particularly from Western countries, but often result in land dispossession, ecological destruction, and exploitative working conditions in the so-called global South. Similarly, the promotion of climate-resistant seeds by agribusiness corporations continues to undermine indigenous and local farming traditions, continues to erode biodiversity, and locks farmers into cycles of dependency on patented technologies. And even seemingly sustainable choices, such as, for instance, adopting a vegan or vegetarian diet, can inadvertently contribute to the very process people seek to challenge. Indeed, for instance, some of these diets are often promoted as ethical alternatives on animal agriculture or against the industrial practice, but actually can still perpetuate extractivism and global inequalities. For instance, very famous is the case of monocropping of soybeans used extensively in plant-based food products, which has contributed to large-scale deforestation, land grabs, and displacement of indigenous communities, particularly in places like South America. And similarly, the growing demand for spirulina algae, often marketed as a superfood in the global north, has prompted extractivist practices in oceans and other ecosystems, threatening marine biodiversity and disrupting local communities who rely on these waters for their livelihood. So what I'm trying to say here is that technological interventions or individual choices, when done within the very same framework that has triggered these very dynamics, can also risk reiterating them rather than challenging them. We can see technological interventions like artificial cloud seeding, for instance, to induce rainfall, or even flood barriers to contain rising sea levels, which might act as short-term fixes, but they fail to address the root causes of climate breakdown, which are extractivism, colonial land relationship, and racial capitalism. And moreover, these responses tend to concentrate powers even more in the hands of states, corporations, and technocrats, sidelining the voices and epistemologies of those most affected. So I am critical of this overemphasis on technological escalation, which again only risks deepening environmental injustice, rather than addressing the very root causes. So I believe that a genuinely decolonial environmental politics must begin by asking who defines the problem, who designs the solutions, and who benefits from it.
Luciana, what from your experience and environmental problems you're familiar with, do you find similar patterns to what Ivana's described?
Yeah, in relation to what I've been teaching, really, I gave a lecture on climate change and art, for example, and I based very much on J. Demos's book, Decolonising Nature, and I think he raised a very important issue, that is the way that, for example, and that related to humanitarian work with, for example, the people who are suffering the Maldives, with climate change, kind of the high sea levels. So what he points out that I think is very important for us to think about is the way that these main efforts to bring attention to them portray the people from the Maldives as a kind of climate refugees. So this idea that they're already kind of fleeing their place is problematic, because they have agency. They are doing things to change, the situation. They need help, to change. They don't want to move, they don't want to go away, So it's a really a problem of kind of climate justice, really, not it's not inevitable. That's the thing, that the way that some of these agencies, that there is a kind of a French collective, it's called Argos Collective, that one of them's case studies, where they do, they try to bring light to their plight, but in a very way, you say, look, a bit like the anthropologists did with vanishing, tribes or something, to document before they have to go. So there's an inevitability in these ways of seeing, these people that are impacted because they are most in the global south, most people, that are is not helpful, because it doesn't give agency to the people, and doesn't really give the right aid that the people need, so he compares their work with Banerjee works, for example, that really are trying to show the how people, their ways of living need a different way of understanding the relationship with the resources. They don't see nature as resources. So and they also show how, in the case of the Maldives, how the kind of tourist industry is completely apart. They don't suffer as much as the rest of the population. So this kind of inequalities, they are in the core of these mega kind of catastrophes, that have been happening, all over the world, and we can't see the people as victims, but they are people who are suffering from what Rob Dixon calls a kind of slow violence. They're already destitute because they have been. So it's it's we really need to change our language as well when we talk about this what is happening. Yeah.
So our last question, and in the interest of time, I think we'll keep this one brief. You've mentioned, both of you have talked a little bit about the kinds of paradigm shifts or the kinds of changes that need to happen in order to help with integrating indigenous knowledge into environmental governance, but also including indigenous communities, not as stakeholders, but as rights holders and decision makers, and really, true inclusion. If you were to pick, the top thing that needs to happen, the one thing that you feel would make the biggest difference, what would it be? Let's start with Luciana for this one.
Well, I think it's really respecting their knowledge and working with them. They are scholars. They have a lot of knowledge. So it's really to listen and to include them in our articles. Work together. I think that's the main difference, really. It changed so much. I think for me has changed a lot. Working together, trying to understand. It's not easy for us. It's not easy because we are so bombarded. We are so, the Western thought is so entrenched in our way of thinking, that to be open to a different way of thinking requires effort, but you have to do it. So I think it's really opening up and listening, and not trying to impose our own ways of thinking and kind of structures of approaching knowledge. So I think be more generous.
And Ivana, how about you?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Luciana just said. The first step would be for policies to affirm the very sovereignty of indigenous people over their lands, territories, and resources, ensuring their recognition, but in their own terms rather than within colonial frameworks of validation. And this also requires to move beyond the dominant discourse of rights or solutions or governance, or, as Luciana said, of crisis, and instead prioritizing issues of historical and ongoing injustice, inequality, reparations, and redistribution. Specifically, it also begins with the recognitions that racialized communities, particularly in the so-called global south, are the ones who bear most the impacts of climate change, while elite states or companies in the global north are responsible for the majority of its causes. And therefore, any possible transitions toward sustainability must also dismantle the economic, political, and cultural system that continues to perpetuate these disparities. This is particularly important because despite the increasing visibilities of indigenous communities at global forums such as the UN or climate change panels, their participation is indeed often reduced to tokenism. So while they might be invited to speak, these invitations frequently serve more as symbolic gestures rather than genuine attempts to integrate indigenous voices and knowledge into decision-making processes. So in many cases, indigenous representatives are invited to panels and discussion, but without real power to influence outcomes or contribute to shaping of policies. And this somewhat superficial inclusion tends to overlook the structural barriers indigenous communities face, such as land dispossession, ongoing colonial violence, and marginalization, which are, again, the very root of environmental crisis. And as a result, the solution often presented in these spaces often fail to address these very systemic inequalities that exacerbate environmental harm, particularly in indigenous territories. True inclusion for me means that representation can be a part of it, but it also requires much more. It demands basically that indigenous people be treated as equal partners with the autonomy and agency to drive the solutions that directly affect their lands, cultures, and futures.
Thank you, Ivana, and thank you, Luciana. We're going to wrap up there. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us, and then we'll move to questions from our audience.